Tomasz Joseph Kosinski. Slav does not mean slave. One of the topics of the book Slavinsky Tajemnici, meaning Slavic mysteries, by this author, published on March 22, 2023. Introduction. The false translation of the ethnonym Slav, in Polish, Slavianin, as slave still persists in historical sciences. This is most likely the result of age-old attempts to degrade the Slavs, through various forms of distorting the truth about their history, heritage, culture, and themselves. Devaluing proper names in order to re-evaluate or change their meaning is a popular way of propaganda, in which historians or linguists have also participated, demonstrating a servile attitude towards decision-makers who determine the established historical policy in a given country. It is regrettable that until now we have not been able to eradicate from academic narration and public discourse the false thesis about the slave meaning of the name Slav, and the association of this people with servitude and subjection. This is not only a false but also a harmful image, especially in the era of European unitarism and the assumed community of interest above historical divisions. It is surprising that the shameful and dishonorable practice of slave trading is also attributed to the Slavs themselves, who allegedly sold the members of their families for profit. However, such claims are only speculations without source basis and can be treated only as pseudoscientific speculations, motivated most likely only by the self-interest or servility of scholars and journalists. Historical records say nothing on this subject, and moreover, present the Slavs as a people who particularly respect freedom, both their own and that of other nations. Ancient Slavs valued freedom above all else. During peacetime, the rally ruled as the body of direct democracy, and the leader, the prince, was elected during wartime, assisted by voivodes as the chiefs of individual tribes' armies. Noble freedom was known throughout Europe, and its expression was the application of the liberum veto principle in the Commonwealth, allowing opposition even by one deputy. European monarchs of that time were amazed by such rules, as they caused the risk of stagnation in the decision-making process, which our expansionist neighbors eventually began to exploit by bribing senators and ultimately leading to the paralysis and collapse of the state. Mariusz Agnosewicz wrote in 2000 in his article about how the most freedom-loving people gave the name to slaves. Although he doesn't really know where the etymology of the word sklavus came from, he at least notices that the merger of the words Slav and sklavus occurred during the development of the Carolingian Empire. He rightly assumes that the new Latin word is derived from the ethnonym Slav, as a popular nation enslaved during the march of Christianity, and not, as many linguists claim, the other way around. Among these experts in linguistic acrobatics was Alexander Brickner, who derived the name Slavianin, Slav, precisely from the Greek sklavanoi, and Latin sklavus, meaning slave. According to him, and authors who repeated the same thing, this term only referred to those Slavic tribes that bordered the Roman Empire, and only later did it become widespread throughout the Slavic lands. It was not taken into account that it could have been the other way around, and that these words appeared in later medieval, not classical, Greek and Latin precisely from the name of the Slavs. Franciszek Szarczynski strongly disagrees with the authors who claim that the name Slavs comes from the Latin term for a warrior branch, sklavus, but he rather believes the opposite. He cites Fortunat Doric, who showed that the derivation of the name Sclavonians from the word sklave or esclave is incorrect. Another author he cites, Joseph Rohrer, also admitted this in 1800, explaining that by attempting to derive the name Sclavonians from the word slave, some wanted to find a reason to humiliate this nation and justify their enslavement. In a similar way and for the same reasons, the ethnonym Serbian, and Serbs were derived from another Latin word, servus, which also means servant, as if the whole nation were to be classified as slaves of ancient Rome. According to him, all foreign names for the Slavic people and land are later than them and demonstrate a distortion of the original name of the Slavs. Szarczynski speculates that the attribution of the meaning of slave to the word Slavianin may have occurred through the intermediation of the Avars, who conquered part of the Slavs and treated them as their property. However, since Brickner also published his books in German and made a career at German universities, while few have heard of Szarczynski, German narratives and the false version of the Slav's name originating from slaves still dominate in Polish linguistics and history. Polish, Czech, and Russian Slavs have, of course, tried to find other etymologies for the ethnonym Slavanin, but they have come up with so many conjectures that one could get the impression that nothing is still known about this matter. Somehow, no one has yet noticed that the claim that the ethnonym Slavianin in the form of Sklavus comes from Classical Latin does not really match the accepted paradigm that the Slavs appeared in Europe in the 6th or 7th century when Classical Latin ceased to be used, and early medieval Latin, which was in circulation then, referred only to a surface Slavus, as Masori reports in his book from 1998. Therefore, it seems that the merger of both terms, Slav-Slavinin and Sklav-Slave, occurred even later. Some linguists also look for the origins of this ethnonym in Greece, where Slavs were called Sklavanoi, which in the inflectional form becomes Sklavin, which is somewhat similar to the Greek word for slave, Slavoi, but these two words do not seem to be synonymous. Some linguists, such as Vasilov, explain that due to the fact that the Greek and Latin languages use the variation of SL and SKL, and there is interchangeability between B and V or W, because there is no separate letter in Greek and Latin for the W sound, as a result of linguistic processes, the name for Slavs has become similar to the word for slave. However, they do not explain when this happened or whether it was an intentional or accidental process. In any case, linguists, followed by historians, claim that the Greek word sklavonoi means slaves, and in the singular form, sklave or slavoi means slave. However, it seems to be a rather late Byzantine addition to the Greek dictionary, probably for political reasons, since originally in Greek, the word for slave was doulos. The same goes for the Latin word sclavus, which supposedly meant slave, although in Classical Latin, the word servus was used to refer to such a person. It is also important to remember that it was not the Slavs who appeared in the 6th century, but only their ethnonym was recorded by historians in this form. There is no historical evidence that they came from the East, and no one wrote about it. However, our historians, for whom historical sources are supposed to be the most important, do not seem to mind believing in the allochthonic theory. Contrary to their claims, Slavs existed in our lands since ancient times, but were known to the Romans and other peoples by different names, such as the Veneti, Vendels, Sarmatians, and even partly Germans, as the term Germania is a geographical political concept, not an ethnic one, encompassing peoples of various origins, including Teutonic, Celtic, Sarmatian, or even Venetian Slavic. Why do many historians not believe Jordanes when he clearly wrote that Slavs are known by three names, Veneti, Sklavens, and Antes, and clearly indicating that the original common name for this large tribe was Veneti, Wends? Regarding the identification of the Vandals and the Wends, as well as other peoples with the Slavs, many medieval and later chroniclers and historians wrote about it, such as Adam of Bremen, Kadlubek, Shishva, Bashko, Mihovata, Wilhelm of Nieburg, Wilhelm of Rubrich, Pribojevich, Orbany, Sarnitsky, Krantz, Decius, Melanchthon, Bugenhagen, Kantsov. There is a lot of information about the Vandals associated with the Palabian or generally Western and Lahitic Slavs also in German annals, including Annales Sangallenses, Annales Alemannici, Annales Augustini. However, there are no historical records or other written sources from ancient or medieval times that clearly indicate that the Vandals or Wends were Proto-Germanic peoples. Only Tacitus showed his ignorance on the subject because he did not know whether to classify the Wends as Germans, as they built huts, or as Sarmatians, who lived on wagons. The Wends' tendency towards long migrations, typical of nomads rather than settled peoples, raised doubts in him. It is strange that later on, these Germans who supposedly liked the settled way of life would conquer Rome and wander throughout Western Europe and North Africa. I am not the only one who sees that something is not quite right here, especially since the morpheme wend is also the root of the verb to wander, which has been preserved in the Anglo-Saxon borrowing wander with the same meaning. Additionally, a similarly root-derived noun in English, vendor, means a merchant or trader, that is, a kind of traveler. Establishing the lineage of ancient peoples such as the Vandals, Wends, Veneti, Lugi, Suevi, Heruli, Marcomanni, Boii, Bistarni, and many others, as well as attributing certain archaeological cultures, such as the Lusatian, Wilbark, Shevorsk, and Cherniakhov to specific ethnic groups, may dispel our doubts about whether the Proto-Slavs inhabited Central Europe in antiquity or not. And thus, who is right in the Yala versus autochthonous dispute? As for the topic of the origin of the ethnonym Slovanin, Slav, based on the above findings, it may follow that the Slavs could have had contact with the Roman Empire, but that does not unequivocally confirm that the Latin word Sclavus existed. It is also worth noting the semantic similarities between the name Sloveni, Slavs, from Slavic slovo, meaning word, vindobe, wens, from venda, knowledge, and lehi, Poles, probably from the Greek word lehi, meaning word, as we know. All of them are related to word or knowledge, which does not seem to be a coincidence. Therefore, if the Slavs, Wends, and Poles are only synonyms, we can conclude that Jordanes and other earliest authors writing about the Wends meant the Proto-Slavs. Paragraph 1. In ancient Rome, according to the autochthonous concept, there could not have been Slavic prisoners of war, but there were Germanic slaves. One could ask at the very beginning how the ethnonym Sklav, Slav, Slavan, Slavanin, came about in ancient Rome, from the word sklavus, which some of our historians and journalists on historical portals claim means slave, while at the same time adhering to the autochthonous theory of the late arrival of Slavs to Central Europe, since Rome fell at the end of the 5th century, resulting in the decline of classical Latin, in which such a word did not exist, and a slave, as I mentioned earlier, was referred to by the term servus. According to the academic version of history, the Romans did not have contact with the Slavs, who were supposed to come from beyond the Dnieper River only in the 6th or 7th century AD. Therefore, it should be concluded that the slaves in Rome were not Slavs, but rather Germans. Why then did the Latin word slave not come from their name, but we are being told that the name Germans means brothers in Latin? Whose brothers? The Romans or the Celts? And where was the Latin word germanus, meaning brother, found in classical Latin? As we know, it was only a nickname of the conquerors of Germania, not their brothers. It is also hard to believe that it was a Celtic name that was adopted, because logic dictates that the Romans would not have considered the hostile Germans to be a brotherly people, so they certainly would not have used an expression with such a meaning towards them, leaving it at best to the Celts, who also fought the Germans not very fraternally. Besides, the Romans had many of their own words with which they called other peoples, and they did not have to adapt Celtic words, i.e., those that came from enemies of Rome. If it did happen, they gave foreign words their own meaning, often not even understanding their original etymology. This was most likely the case with the foreign-sounding name of the Germans, which according to Tacitus comes from the people of Tungri, which may mean in Slavic Tingorzani, that is, strong mountaineers, because Slavic Tangi means powerful, and Gora is mountain. They could be inhabitants of great mountains, the Gorman people, Highlanders, precisely. It could have been the same with the Suevi, who, according to Jacob Grimm, or Slavi, living in Germania, whose name the Romans could have adopted into their language as Sclavus, translating this name into their own language, as I will explain in a moment. Therefore, either Roman soldiers captured Slavic slaves in the first centuries of our era somewhere in the marshes of the Pripets, so it is not true that they had no contact with them, or the Latin word sclavus did not mean slave, or it did not exist at all in ancient Latin. Perhaps, therefore, it is only a medieval propaganda invention, created in the period after the fall of Rome in the face of wars with free Slavs, or a much later political move aimed at devaluing certain proper names of peoples in order to insult them, including Slavi, Slavs, as slaves, Vandali as Vandals, Dacians, Dux, as Diaconus, Serbians, Serbi, as Servi. As far as we know from sources, the Romans in Europe mainly took representatives of peoples called Gauls or Germans into captivity, because they lived in geographical regions, the provinces called Gallia and Germania. They did not distinguish at that time between the Proto-Celtic, Proto-Germanic and Proto-Slavic ethnic groups. They only knew the names of tribes, which they distorted in their writings, or simply associated with the most similar ones in their language or translated their meanings into Latin. On the triumphal column of Marcus Aurelius located on Piazza Colonna, there are details with German women taken by the Romans as slaves. Furthermore, the motif of German slaves, especially women, is known in medieval art. There are no similar analogies from this period with Slavic captives, however. So I will ask again. How is it possible that having the Latin word servus, the Romans introduced another word for a slave, sclavus, when from accounts and archaeological finds, it appears that the Roman slaves were mainly Germans? Why then does the word Germanus not mean slave? Or perhaps these Germans are a name that also includes Slavs or mainly Slavs, since this additional term for a Roman servant was supposed to originate from their ethnonym. It is also worth finding out what names slaves had in Rome, where there is no mention of any word sclavus, but there is a lot about servus, serva, poor, por. In the empire, slaves did not have the right to their own surnames, but instead, their owner's name was used with the suffix pur or por, meaning boy. For example, Cassiper was the boy, slave, of Cassius, Flaviper was the boy of Flavius, Markiper was the boy of Marcus, and so on. Greek suffixes and designations with their master's name were also sometimes used to name a servant. The word servus, serva, literally meant servant, slave, hence the English word service. Since in the Roman Empire there could not be Slavic slaves but only Germanic ones, it is necessary to reject the thesis that the word sclavus ever existed in classical Latin. The word sclave, meaning slave, probably only appeared in the Frankish chronicles, in Byzantine Greek, Papal medieval Latin, and then in the emerging languages of French, Spanish, Anglo-Saxon, and German. In Greek, as I mentioned before, there was another word for slave besides the one our wise historians give us, namely doulos. It was only later that the Greek sklavonoi appeared, meaning slaves, in the singular sklave, slave. One can speculate that the word sklave, as a transcription of the foreign word slave, passed into other languages with a new propagandistic meaning, including medieval Latin and the languages derived from it, such as Spanish esclavo, Portuguese escravo, as well as later into German in the form of sklave, and the Yiddish sklav, an Anglo-Saxon slave. On the other hand, the option cannot be excluded that the Greek Byzantine sklave is a Latin loanword. If sklavus was not chosen by chance but as the most phonetically similar word from Latin to the foreign and incomprehensible Slav, but rather as a match of a Latin word with a similar sound to a Slavic name, and giving it a local meaning, then the process of absorbing this word into Latin could have taken place even in Rome, not in Byzantium. This would confirm, incidentally, the autochthonic theory of the origin of the Slavs. However, when we delve into the subject, it turns out that this derogatory term is the shameful achievement of Jewish merchants who traded in Slavic captives captured and sold by Romans, Franks, Greeks, and Byzantines. They coined it from the Latin sclavini, calling this precious Slavic merchandise so colloquially. The Jews themselves had a complex about this, which remained with them from the times of slavery in Egypt, so making slaves of Slavs was convenient for them, especially when they themselves served their Arab masters. The Franks, the main slave traders, who acquired their captives during their numerous wars with pagans, quickly and willingly picked up this new term. Over time, they popularized it in other European countries, thus passing it on to other languages. Of course, it was a deliberate move by the Franks against their Slavic enemies, to make slaves of those who valued freedom, who were resistant to Christianization and conquest, and to call them by this name. They were thus erasing the slave image of the Germans in Rome, invoking the triumphs of the Germanic conquerors of the Eternal City, with whom they had fought before, but that did not matter to Charlemagne. After taking power in the western and southern parts of the former Roman Empire, he took on the title of emperor and the old state name, disregarding the fact that its continuation was the empire with its capital in Constantinople. The process of conquering the Slavs by the Carolingians and the Ludolfings was to last for many centuries. Slavic captives mainly ended up on the Arab market with the help of Radhanites. At the same time, the struggle was not only with swords but also with words. And authors such as Isidore of Seville or Paul the Deacon, who created useful versions of history and appropriate etymologies, helped in the pious work of presenting only the correct version of history as divine truth, for the glory of the papacy and the empire. Fortunately, there are also scholars like Peter Jones or Dominika Dlugosz, who today consider the stories and etymologies provided by the mentioned authors as nonsense. taking care of the national image and controlling certain inconvenient facts, as well as tendentious interpretation of history, unfortunately, is still the norm in many countries, including Western Europe. Such practices also include erasing the traces of Germanic slaves in Rome, which can only be surprising in the era of the European community. And yet there are countless examples of such treatment of the matter. At the same time, public discourse still encounters reports of the submissive nature of the Slavs and the lordly character of the Germans. An example of manipulating facts and covering up inconvenient facts, as well as whitewashing the image, is, for example, the illustration from 1854, by Remy Cog, titled Verkauf Germanischer Sklaven, which in English means Sale of Germanic Slaves. It was placed in the publication Zur Gutstand from 1895, on which Germanic slaves are depicted in a Roman camp market. What is surprising, however, is that this illustration is presented in the online edition of the Gutenberg Encyclopedia from 2003, but already without information that they are Germanic slaves, only some slaves, without ethnic affiliation. It can also be found on the internet with the description that it is not the sale of Germanic but Iberian slaves. This is how Germans whiten their image, and in the meantime, we are discussing Slavic slaves and their trade. Paragraph 2. Italian ciao, meaning at your service. In Italian, Swabian, Slav, means Slavo, but slave is Sciavo. They seem similar, but let's check the etymology of this word. And here we go. Italian Sciavi is actually key, in Latin clavum from clavus, a nail, a strap, a row, a line. In Spanish it has the form clavi. By the way, it is worth noting that in Greek, the key is klidi, from which the ethnonym quadi may derive. The well-known Roman name Claudius is keyman, steward, like a prison guard. One of the higher positions in Rome was tribunus angusti clavius, that is, a narrow-striped tribune, from narrow pink stripes on a tunic. We also have the Latin word conclavi from medieval Latin cum clavi, meaning under lock and key, because no one can leave this assembly until a new pope is elected. Therefore, in Italian, a person kept under lock and key is Sciavo, not Slavo. So in Italian, these two terms are different, so it was not the Italians, as descendants of the Romans, who meddled in this dirty game with words. Since sclavus, that is s, plus clavus, means with a key, we may need to look for a different meaning of this term. An association with goose keys comes to mind, which were greatly valued by both the Romans and the Venetians and the Wends, Slavs. According to Livy, the geese warned the inhabitants of Rome with their cry, some of whom took refuge on the Capitoline during the siege by the Celts in 390 before Christ. The Wends, Slavs, who are probably related to the Venetians, also revered geese as sacred birds that carried human souls. The key may be a synonym for the tribe or may refer to guardians of secret knowledge, for example. This reminds us of the native term of the Scythians, in the form of skolatoi, whose endonym probably means from a circle, because in Slavic kolo is a ring, rally, clan, or tribe. So maybe it's just a synonym, if we accept, according to some historians, that the Slavs are descendants of the Scythians. Meanwhile, the geniuses from Wikipedia are trying to convince us that the Italian greetings ciao and service were actually used as a greeting by slaves to their masters. In other words, they want us to believe that this supposed greeting of servitude has made its way into higher classes and has become a popular greeting in all classes, still in use today. Wikipedians try to explain that the Italian word sciavo, which means slave, comes from the Florentine dialect. In Venetian, it first had the form sciavo, sciavo, then scio, and finally ciao, just like in Lombard dialect. The Italian greeting ciao, which originally appeared in Piemonte dialect as ciao, in Genoese as scio, and in southern Italy as scio, was popularized in Europe in the 20th century. It is supposed to be a shortened form of sciavo, which means your slave. Similarly, the displacement of the Latin word service by ciao in Italy was intended to replace the greeting service, which was still used in Poland and Germany, in which slaves used to greet their masters since ancient Roman times. In my opinion, however, service was a polite greeting used in commerce, meaning at your service, and not some kind of I'm a slave. On the other hand, ciao, which originated from sciavo, Sklavo, and originally Slava, meaning glory in Slavic languages, was simply borrowed from this popular Slavic greeting, which could have been brought to Rome by Slavic mercenaries and advisors, not necessarily slaves. However, it should be noted that some peoples, such as the so-called Germanic tribes, like the Lugi, Lengi, Lenhi, Lehi, the Vandals, Huns, Vens, from the word dal, Slavic dal, Gulina, means delve, or valley, the Heruli, Slavic or plus orli, means high eagles, the Markomans, later Moravians, the Suevians, Slavians, and perhaps even the Lombards, Longobardi, Slavic Langobardi, the brothers of the Lugi, Lengi or Lenhi, Lehi, also known as Winuli or the aforementioned Vandals, actually had a Slavic origin and could speak the Proto-Slavic language rather than Proto-Germanic. Paragraph 3. Arabic Sakaliba is a term used for Slavs, who are descendants of the noble Sacs. Arabs referred to Slavs as Sakaliba, in the singular form Siklab, which sounds similar to Sklab, or Slav. This term supposedly means slave in Arabic, although the term Ibd or Abd was used for slaves, as in the name Abdul. Linguists believe that the word Sakaliba comes from the Greek term for Slavs, Skalabonai. However, Sakaliba likely originated from the combination of Sak, meaning Sacs, that is one of the terms for the Scythians, and Alaba, which we can divide into Ali, the highest, greatest, most noble, plus element Bog, a short form of Baba, without duplication, meaning ancestor, father, or leader, like the legendary Alibaba. Therefore, the Arab ethnic name for Slavs refers to their descent from the Sacs, the Scythian Sarmatians, as great ancestors, which has nothing to do with slavery, but quite the opposite. However, it is a fact that the Carolingians, Byzantines, and Danes sold Slavic captives through Jewish merchants, mainly to the Arab market, from where other goods were imported. Over time, during trade negotiations, the ethnic name probably began to refer to the origin of this living, Slavic commodity for enterprising Arabs who were not concerned with scruples towards infidels, until it became a synonym for slave in the Arabic language. It should be noted that Sakaliba did not originally mean slave, but it was a derogatory term coined for Slavic slaves, not only in the Arab world, but also in Europe, where numerous Slavic captives were taken in wars and conquests. It is hypocritical that Christian rulers enriched themselves by selling people through Jews to Arabs, who were their religious enemies at the time. As Vespasian said, money does not stink, and it was more important than biblical principles and the proclaimed Christian morality. Paragraph 4. Manipulation of word meanings as a tool of propaganda warfare. Not only in the case of the name Slav have attempts been made to manipulate its meaning by devaluing it. We have several similar examples of intentional revaluation of proper names in order to humiliate a given nation, which is undoubtedly a despicable propaganda tactic. This was done with the Vandals, who were the plunderers of Rome, and that is why to this day the word Vandal has a negative connotation, meaning destroyer, cruel person. The term vandalism was first used by the French bishop Henri Grégoire in 1794, to describe the destruction of works of art after the French Revolution. The ethnonym Serb, with the addition of b, v, and w, is also associated with the Latin servus, meaning servant, just like doc is connected with the Latin diaconus and the Greek diakonos, meaning servant. Could it be that these nations were really enslaved and their ethonyms were imposed from the outside? On the contrary, some of their tribal names and names clearly emphasize freedom and self-determination, the lack of a ruling lord over them, such as the name Samo, which means autocrat, or Svevlad, meaning self-ruler. The root sve is also present in the form of svivi, which can be an abbreviation of Svevladi, free people without any lords over them. We also have the Lugi people, or Lengi, Lenhi, where Slavic Leng means nest, or clan, and La means lord, not servant. By the way, some linguists derive the term Slav from Slavic sloboda, freedom, with the interchange of b and v, or w, and after breaking it down, we get two Slavic component parts, slovo, word, and r, give. This is freedom, the highest value given to people honorably on divine word of promise, which also deserves closer attention here. Therefore, if the Slavic peoples were any kind of servants, it was only to God, just as the term diakon, servant of God, originated. If they exceptionally served other people, it was only as mercenaries, well-trained soldiers, or by falling into slavery during the constant wars with invaders. Let's pay attention to the fact that from the above-mentioned ethnonym Suv, Swav, Sveb, Swab, with the visible alternations B, V, W, the name Shvab, and later the Shvabians, was made, because the priority here was probably verbal Germanization of the name of this people, so S became SCH, and historians could more convincingly claim that these are the ancestors of the Germans. Therefore, it can be confidently argued that Swabia, Shvabia, is nothing else but a modified Slavia, just as the Suvi, Subi are the Swavi, Swavs, Slavs. However, if it were acknowledged that they were a Proto-Slavic people, as many authors, including Mihavata, Orbany, Klechevsky, Pop, and Matsiovsky, claim, who knows if they would not be considered Slavic Swabi, that is weak, despite Tacitus notes about their strength and power. One can only speculate about the simple calculation of profits and losses in each situation. In this case, as we can see, it was more profitable to make Proto-Germans out of this powerful people, than weak warriors from the Slavic clan. Subi may also mean a people from the Elbe, whose name may come from lava, Laba, that is, a water corridor to the Baltic Sea. The ancient names of this river, Elbis, like Albion, meaning the brightest kingdom, or Elba, which is an anagram of Bel, writing with double E, similar to the Slavic bright god Bel, like the ancient Baal, refer to the word Alb, or Alv, meaning bright, like Olv, Slavic olive, lead, and elf, fair-haired. They may also be a simple distortion of the Slavic hydronym Leba, Elba, Elba. The inhabitants of the Elba, Liba, that is, Sliba, could simply be Palabians, and in the version of Suvi, they were the Suvs, Swavs, Slavs. This example clearly shows us that the range of possibilities for deriving this ethnonym, as well as others like it, is very wide, and no certain conclusions can be drawn from linguistic research alone. Therefore, we should look for other confirmations to legitimize any of the above-mentioned versions of the etymology of this name. In such situations, historical accounts and tracking the records of this ethnonym in various periods and languages should come to our aid. Here, we can see a clear path to the artificial creation of the name Shvab, from Swab, Swav, Sub, Svev, Sveb, Shveb, through the Germanization of the original Latin records, which were most likely also distortions of the Slavic name, difficult to write in Greek or Latin, where there were no signs for the Slavic L with stroke sound, so it was replaced using the letters U, V, B, and then W. In later German, the S sound was also hardened to SCH, giving rise to Shvab, coined from Swav. Anyway, as Jacob Grimm also proves, Suvi, Subi, is a Slavic name, and turning them into Prussians stems from the appropriation of the name of the Germans by German ideologues during the Renaissance period, who created the foundations for the vision of Great Germany. Similarly, Luther, and after him others, made Hermann out of Arminius, the bravest hero of the Germans, whom, however, only from the 16th century began to be recognized as the ancestors of the Teutons. These were certainly the maneuvers of the Hohenzollerns, who were losing wars to Poland, and Albrecht Hohenzollern, the last Grand Master of the Teutonic Order in Prussia, on April 10, 1525, submitted a feudal act to King Sigmund the Old in Krakow, later called the Prussian Homage. Unable to come to terms with this fact of subjugation, intrigues began to be plotted at German courts and maneuvers invented to discredit the Slavs, especially the Poles, whom they could not defeat on the battlefield. The war of words was easier than the battle of swords. By applying such manipulation of the meanings of words, one can equally well make not warriors out of Slavic meaning of boyi, but those who are boyati, afraid. On a similar principle, but in the opposite direction, from Engels, whose name derives from the Old Slavic Ongel, Egel, Ugul, meaning, how similar, Egel, which simply gives us people who sit in the lower corner of the Jutland Peninsula, also called Wendish, divine angels, were made. Similarly, the Saxons, that is, Sac plus sons, otherwise sons of the Sacs, descendants of the Scythians, are strangely explained as axemen, linking their ethnonym with the Anglo-Saxon word axe, which is a transformation of the Slavic word aksha, a tool for debarking wood. The same goes for the Germans, Gorman, Highlanders, which I have already explained, who were mated to brothers of the alleged Germanus, brother, unconfirmed in any ancient historical accounts. Interpretative problems of the etymology of many other ethonyms also keep linguists awake at night. For curiosity's sake, I would only mention a few, such as Poles, that is, Polaks, Polish Polacy, like Polacy, that is, descendants of Laks. Whereas, the element po means after. Or maybe it is a doubtful transformation of the term pollens from Polish pole, field, or maybe from a town, like the Greek polis, polis, which may also be a Slavic borrowing. We know the preserved Slavic word okwoles, meaning an circular settlement, that is, a field in the shape of an O, oval. Meanwhile, the ethnonym lex may come from liha, a patch of land, also called wa, lenha, hence perhaps la, which elsewhere means a lord, landowner, ruler of a okwoles, field, town, or given country or territory. We also see a coincidence with lenda, a piece of land, and the term lendi, lens, lendians in the case of the variant lenhi. It is similar to the word lingi, derived from the word lang, nest, clan. In this case, there are many possibilities, and knowing the Slavs' love of word games, all of these meanings may be appropriate, because as we can see, they are very close in meaning to each other. Relatives of Lav, Bohemi, and Bohemians may be Bohilmobii, meaning mountain warriors or great warriors, as Slavic helm means mountain. On this occasion, it is worth noting that the English word boy appears to be a loan from the Slavic boy, voy, meaning warrior. Meanwhile, the name Vandals may mean vans, vens, vens, and morpheme dal means valley. Alternatively, it may refer to the Wind people from Slavic dal, bottom, the southern region of the Vistula River, where the Vandals had their original settlements, up to Krakow. Vincent Kadlubek derived the name of this people, which is another name for Lex or ancient Poles, from the name Wanda, daughter of Krak, ruler of former Poland, called Lechia, with capital in Krakow. Perhaps this is only folk etymology, or perhaps the existing explanations in etymological dictionaries are also only the result of a certain overinterpretation, under specific assumptions far from historical truth. In return for appropriating the names of Germans, Slavs, and Prussians, the Slavs reciprocated the Teutons with nicknames like Nemci, Nemi, Nude, or calling them Prusaki, an unpleasant bug. The exonym Nemi, in Slavic, can also mean not us in the sense of foreigner, in opposition to our Slavic, or Nemech, meaning not from a sword, clan, or Nemeches, not having, that is one who does not possess land or just only grab it. The Germans themselves, in order to undermine such a humiliating designation, derived this name from some minor Celtic tribe Nemedi, which may remind us of Nemodi, incompetent, or Nemadi, meaning orphans without a mati, motherland, or land, which seems to be convergent in meaning with the version not having. Similarly, in the area of Eastern Slavdom, names of state entities were also manipulated for their own purposes. We remember that even the name of the Roman Empire was deliberately taken over by the Germans, even though there was already such an empire in Constantinople. As a result of the competition for political and image legacy after the Roman Empire, to distinguish them, the empire ruled by the Franks began to be called in historiography Western, while the one with the capital in Byzantium, Eastern. Summary. According to academic narrative, there could not have been Slavic slaves in Rome who, until the fall of the empire, were supposed to be sitting on the Pripyat swamps. However, there were certainly Germanic captives. Therefore, historians should decide what they are saying so as not to contradict themselves. Since Rome had no contact with the Slavs, there was no classical Latin term sclavus, and those who claim there was are lying because there is no written evidence. Therefore, it is unfounded to claim that the ethnonym Slav derives from the Latin sclavus, meaning slave. At most, we can wonder how the slave meaning came to be associated with the Slavs in European and Semitic languages. In my opinion, there was no blending of words, as suggested by Anosevich, because there would have had to be two distinct but similar words, one Slavic, as the proper name of the Slavic people, and the other Greek or Latin, sklave or sklavus, meaning slave. However, there is a lack of written evidence for this. Therefore, it is possible that the unintelligible ethnonym sklavus was used for Slavic slaves, prisoners of war from the time of their expansion into the Balkans or even later from the years of the conquests of Charlemagne and Otto the Great. Most likely, the Latin word clave, meaning key, was sought in this foreign-sounding name, which was associated with slavery. Therefore, the word was adopted in that sense in the territories and languages of peoples involved in the slave trade, as well as those subject to the Western and Eastern Empire, not without the participation of war propagandists, chroniclers, bishops, and the whole machinery of warring Christianity. As I mentioned before, artificially created classical Latin fell into oblivion with the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. Therefore, if someone claims that Slavs were slaves in Rome and that's why their ethnonym has such a meaning, they must also admit that some ancient tribes inhabiting Germania had Slavic origins, such as the Vandals, Herul's, Svebi, and Marcomanni. This also confirms the accounts of Kotlubek, who is discredited, about the battles of the Lehites, i.e., the Slavs, with the Caesars. It also contradicts the officially proclaimed alloctonous theory that the Slavs appeared in Central Europe only in the 6th and 7th centuries. So, historians, please decide whether you want to bake the Slavs on one fire of lies, ignoring inconsistencies and the lack of logical consequences in such statements, or strive to present the truth without politically motivated speculations. The whole procedure looks like the work of cunning Franks and Byzantine emperors, that is a slave mafia operating with the help of Jewish merchants who traded not only with Slavs but also with other peoples from Eurasia and Africa. Thanks to this, European rulers also built their power on the trade of human beings. Their loyal writers also began to deal with etymology for political purposes, explaining everything according to their own views and creating neologisms, which German linguists also love to do. They associated the foreign and incomprehensible name of the Slavs with the Latin key, and the slave-like term sklavi emerged, describing the freedom-loving Slavs, whom it was hard for them to conquer. They started fighting with words, using manipulation, intrigue, bribery, and other nefarious methods of ideological warfare. By the way, it is worth refuting the equally harmful propaganda that the Piast dynasty built their power on the trade of their fellow Slavs, as some Polish historians such as Henryk Samsonowicz, Przemysław Urbanczyk, and Kamil Janicki speculate. We are not talking about arranged marriages with foreigners as proof of alliance, or the principle of providing hostages as guarantors of peace, or even holding prisoners of war for a certain period of time, but rather the trading of people for profit. However, according to Agnosewicz, it was primarily our noble neighbors who profited from the sale of prisoners, including women and children, and not the Piasts and their Lechitic ancestors. Perhaps the barrier that created divisions among the Indo-Aryan Slavic peoples was the acceptance or rejection of slavery. Some were able to respect the tradition and natural right to freedom of people, while others, influenced by foreign cultures, betrayed these ideals by selling themselves and their fellow countrymen. The love of freedom and the right of every human being to it, even a prisoner, is one of the basic moral principles of our ancestors, which was also evident in the time of the Commonwealth, and even today. Many chroniclers wrote that the Slavs could not be enslaved. This respect for freedom also had an impact on the treatment of prisoners. They were not sold as slaves, but, as Maurice writes in Strategicon, after serving their sentence, they were returned to freedom and allowed to return home or to stay in the tribe on equal terms. Thietmar also describes how Mieszko released many Saxon prisoners as an act of kindness after his marriage to Oda, which means that he had previously held them captive, but did not trade them as living merchandise. Similarly, Boleslav I the Great, called Hrobry also, what means the brave, was said to have returned captured German knights as a royal gesture and to demonstrate goodwill towards reconciliation with Otto III, whom he apparently did not sell as living goods to Jewish merchants. The relations undoubtedly show that freedom was the highest value for the Slavs, and it is difficult to speculate on the basis that they could deprive their relatives of it by selling them to strangers, as some irresponsibly suggest. Even hostile prisoners were eventually released, respecting their basic rights as free people. Those who claim otherwise engage in pseudoscience because they rely only on conjecture, not on source evidence. Similarly, the persistent attempts to identify the Slavs with slaves are baseless. While this could be understood during the Carolingian conquests, the later struggle for dominance of the European Empire, the times of the Hohenzollerns, Bismarck, or Hitler, it is difficult to justify today. Unless we assume that such a false version of history still serves someone's interests. It is obvious that not only the Franks, Saxons, or Byzantines clearly wanted to identify the Slavs with slaves in order to humiliate the stubborn and decidedly pro-freedom people. And even if we accept, as Agnosevich believes, that this happened naturally during the expansion of Christianity into Slavic lands in the Carolingian conquests, the term Slavic commodity should only be recognized, as I mentioned earlier, as a description of Slavic goods and not the origin of our ethnonym. If scholars claim otherwise, they fall into their own trap, because in trying to label Slavs as Roman slaves, they would have to admit that the Romans fought against the Slavs, and perhaps the Germanic tribes known from historiography also had Slavic roots. With such a highly probable assumption, it would be easier for us to understand that the Heruli are the eagles, because Herul means Herul, that is horny, high-flying eagle, are also written as Earl, which in English is a noble title. The name of the Heruli leader, Odo Acer, may be an anonym, meaning read backwards, giving us the Slavic hidden name, Rintsa Odo, Hand of Odo. We should also have no doubts that the name of the Vandalic leader Genseric is Gensishik in Slavic, meaning from the Gensi, geese, clan. And the Gothic Radagaisis is Slavic Radagos. Theodoric, on the other hand, is Luderitz, meaning knight of the people, since the Germanic morpheme tud comes from lud, which is now read as Lloyd and is a simple borrowing of the Slavic word liad, lud meaning people, population. Therefore, in seeking correctness in the origin of the ethnonym Slavic, we must accept some logical and credible assumptions that condition the following statements. First, if we stick to the allochthonous concept of the Slavs, we must also reject their possible contacts with the Romans, and thus the possibility of borrowing the word Slav or Sklav into classical Latin, which could have eventually come to mean slave. Because such a word cannot be identified in any ancient Roman document, we must reject speculations about the existence of this word in classical Latin, and its appearance in medieval Latin must have a different cause. It is possible that the word was introduced into ancient Latin, as well as Greek and other European and Semitic languages, due to the trade of Slavic slaves between European countries and the Arabs, through Jewish merchants. The term Sklav eventually came to mean Slavic live merchandise, hence the German sklave, Yiddish sklav, English slave, Spanish esclavo, Portuguese escravo, and other exonyms referring to Slavs, such as the Arabs akaliba, which adopted the transferred meaning of the word slave to the ethnonym Slav, in a similar way as the name Wandel came to mean Vendel, a destroyer, and gypsy vagabond from Egyptian wanderer. Similarly, for Ruthenians, the term la was derogatorily changed to wa, meaning a poor person in shabby clothing, even though, in truth, Lahitic knights were known for their elegance. In historical politics and linguistic acrobatics, truth, however, does not matter as much as the desired effect consistent with the manipulator's interests in facts and word meanings. Secondly, if we assume that the Slavs did have contact with the Roman Empire, for example as the Veneti trading emperor, supplying Italy with tin from the Bohemian Massif, iron from the smelters, salt from the salt works, or defending their territories against Roman expansion, then it is possible that the Romans found a new term for Slavic slaves. It is possible that after capturing them, they had trouble recording foreign-sounding names like Mstislav, Mieczyslav, Vinchislav, or Bishislav, and only remembered the recurring ending Slav, which eventually became a distinguishing feature of Slavic slaves and began to function in Latin as a synonym for service, servant. Thirdly, the claim that the ethnonym Slav derives from the Roman Empire, which ceased to exist effectively at the end of the 5th century, while simultaneously supporting the Alachthonic hypothesis of the Slavs, who are supposedly still sitting on the Dnieper River, does not make sense. In any case, the term Slav does not derive from an early medieval neologism like the Latin sclavus, Germanic skla, or Arabic sakaliba, meaning slave, but from Slavic slava, glory, and the form Suovian, Slavian is derived from Suavo, Slovo, word. However, it must be admitted that there are also many other more or less convincing etymologies of these ethnonyms. For example, it is possible that the Slavs, as in Slavnviano, famous dowry, were originally Swavani, meaning famous vans, pans, in English, lords, or also Swaventi, famous Veneti, or Sloviani, inheritors of words or heirs of knowledge. All these suggestions to explain the meaning of the name Slavians, may be true, because the Slavs, as a people derived from Slovo, meaning word, and the fame coming from it, like to play with words, create anagrams, acronyms, ambiguous words. Finally, I must say that it saddens me that there is still more propaganda than history in historical sciences. From the Roman rule of divide and conquer, through insulting nations by devaluing and revaluing the meanings of ethnonyms, as discussed here, to manipulating facts, omitting or destroying many sources, the Roman Papal German version of history still dominates universities and public spaces. Unfortunately, the process of perpetuating the Philo-Germanic narrative continues to this day, and science, especially the humanities, is permeated with servility and manipulation of facts for the purpose of the immediate historical politics of certain countries. Sadly, such actions have anti-Slavic connotations, and it takes many years and significant engagement from a large number of enlightened people to correct the false historical narrative tainted by Turbo-Germanic influences, while also restoring our Slavic past and pride in who we are. Therefore, it is necessary to seek knowledge, search for the truth, defend ourselves and others from manipulations and socio-technical operations, expose lies and overinterpretations, point out errors and false theories of Turbo-Germanic authors, and rebuild our Slavic identity by taking care of the legacy of our ancestors. And of course, we must write and publish a lot, books, articles, polemics, reviews, because as they say, what is written cannot be cut down even with an axe. Let us remember that even when Sigmund III Vasa ordered the burning of all copies of Jan Dlugosz's works, somewhere, a copy survived and was later used to prepare a reprint and a Polish translation. The paths leading to the truth are winding and difficult, but is it worth taking a different path, even if it may be faster and more convenient? Will we really reach our intended destination in the right direction? As Slavs, we should be proud of our origin, and it is our duty to learn about Slavic history, heritage, and culture. Let us not be deceived by lies repeated 1,000 times over 1,000 years, that Slavs are mainly servile slaves, primitive inhabitants of swamps, or illiterate wanderers. This requires respect for our ancestors and ourselves, for those who do not respect themselves will not be respected by anyone. And all the grants and honors from foreign universities are for nothing if we want to build our authority on submission, manipulation, and opportunism. Let us carry the banner and the word of truth to the world, as the Venets, Wens, or Vedans did in the past, believing that the light will always prevail over darkness.